got a Bible with you this morning, please open it to the book of James, and we're going to read from chapter 4 and verse 1. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says, He yearns jealously over the Spirit He has made to dwell in us? But He gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is only, there's only one lawgiver and judge, He who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbour? Amen. Amen. Wisdom, that's what we were thinking about last week, wasn't it, when we turned to the book of James. And this passage that we've looked at is really part 2, following on from last week. I'd wanted to take the two together because they fit very nicely with each other, but there wasn't quite time. What did we see last week? We saw that wisdom is this understanding of reality that leads us to live a certain way. And we saw that there's two kinds of wisdom. James said there's a wisdom that comes from above, and there's a wisdom that comes from below. The wisdom from below that has its roots in hell, James told us. It's a greedy, grasping kind of wisdom that puts me at the centre. The wisdom from above, well, that comes down from heaven. It's as though we said there was a line through all of reality, and below the line is everything that God has made. And the wisdom from below comes from below that line. Above the line is the Creator, it's the Lord God. And the wisdom from above is wisdom from God that's broken into our world. We read that wisdom just before in verse 17 of chapter 3, that beautiful description. And the wisdom of God has come into our world in His Word and then in the person of Jesus Christ. And it's not a me-first wisdom, not a selfish wisdom. It's a wisdom that humbly serves. It's all about mercy, grace, sincere, peace-loving, it was described as. Ultimately, it's a cross-shaped wisdom. And what we're going to see today is James takes that picture of a wisdom from above and a wisdom from below, and he applies it to the church, to us, particularly to our relationships with one another. And he's asking us, which kind of wisdom are we following? You see, there's no room for a kind of blend of the two. The wisdom from above and the wisdom from below are opposites, and we can't splurge them together and pick from here and pick from there and try to get a hybrid. James calls that being double-minded or double-hearted. And in the book of James, that's the kind of the ultimate wrong thing to do. There's no sitting on the fence. There's no having a leg on the pier and a leg in the boat. It just doesn't work. This letter is to Christians. It's to Christians whom God has planted his word in. We saw that in chapter 1. His word of wisdom, it's been planted in them, and James says they become the first fruits of all that God has created. That's a world of righteousness. Ultimately, it's pointing us ahead to the new creation. But James is warning, really. The whole book is a warning to people who think they can sit on the fence, who think they can kind of look to the new creation, but also have the values of this world and live for the here and now. He wants these Christians to persevere in living God's way. So as we look at this passage this morning, there's 3 headings, and they're not going to come up on the screen. I think there's been a technical glitch of some sort. So the first heading I'll give it you is called The War of Worldly Wisdom. And as James thinks about wisdom and puts his eyes on the church, he has in his sights the area of conflict within the church. You can see there's lots of conflict language in verses 1 to 3, so just have a look. He talks about fights, he talks about quarrels, he talks about battles, he talks about killing. They're strong words, aren't they, for what's going on in a church. Now, I don't think there was people who James was writing to who were actually killing one another because they couldn't get what they want. I think James uses these words, these battle words, these conflict words, because he wants to know how serious the problem is. The people probably weren't fist fighting, but they were probably using their words. Their words as weapons. We've seen already how powerful the tongue is. And Jesus, when he spoke, reminded us that anger and murder, they share the same root. They're from the same family. So when James talks about battles and fights and killing one another, I think he's talking about angry words, the damage our tongues can do. And if we're honest, sometimes churches can be a war zone, can't they? Sometimes. Hopefully rarely, but they can feel like that. People say things to one another, and it can sometimes feel like they're casualties lying around wounded. That saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words never hurt me. It's just not true, is it? Words do a lot of damage. What is it that fuels this conflict that's going on among these Christians? Well, verse 1, James says the battles come from your desires within you. He says you desire, but you do not have. Verse 2, you covet, but you cannot get what you want. This desiring, this me-centeredness, that's what we're causing the conflicts. That's why I've called it the war of worldly wisdom. This is the kind of battle that living according to worldly wisdom leads to. These desires, this false wisdom from below, selfish ambition and bitter envy, when we want to feed our own need and make sure we get what we need and we get put first. That's the wisdom from below. And these desires that are within us, they're pictured as soldiers, kind of ready and prepared for battle, rifle in hand, ready to go. And the minute your self-interest bangs up against my self-interest, the bullets start to fly. That's what these desires do. And these bullets, they usually come from our mouth. Not usually a direct frontal facial shot, but sometimes behind the back. That's how we can use our words. And this is the wisdom of the world. And the problem is that for the people who James was writing to, wisdom of the world was the way that the church was living. They were living according to the wisdom from below. These were Christians that had received the good news. And it's perhaps a little depressing that this letter, it's not to a specific church, it's to a scattered people, to Christians in general. And James can write this general letter and write about conflict specifically and know that it will apply. It will apply to whichever Christians he's writing to. Because sadly, this is, as I said, sometimes the reality of life in church. There can be bad feelings, there can be unrest, There can be frustrated and unmet desires. Someone wants to do something this way and someone wants to do something this way. And there's frustrations. And these can simmer away beneath the surface. Selfish words get spoken. Words get received in a self-centered attitude. We avoid this person. We don't speak to that person. We move church to go somewhere else. I'm sure we all have experience of this kind of thing in some form or another. Because sometimes this is what church is like. These battle lines get drawn. But what God is showing us this morning as a church is that the root of this kind of conflict is in worldly wisdom. That's where it comes from. And this worldly wisdom doesn't only affect our relationship with one another, it can also affect our relationship with God. So look at verse 3. James begins to talk about prayer. He says, "You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions." Even our prayers can sometimes be ordered by the wisdom from below and our own desires. Jesus, what did he teach us to pray? Jesus taught us to pray, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done." And sometimes in our praying, we forget that, don't we? And our prayers become shaped by our desires and what we want to happen. It's not wrong to pray about our desires and our needs, but sometimes our prayers can be driven by the wisdom from below. And that was certainly what was happening here to the people that James was writing about. One author writes this: "Sometimes we turn God into a divine waiter. He is there to deliver our dreams to us. We touch base with him on a Sunday. We put our order in via prayer. We might give a decent tip. But God is essentially there to give us what we feel we need." As I read these verses from James, I was challenged, what is the content of my prayer? Or maybe a better question is, what is it that makes me really pray? You know, what is it that drives me to prayer? Often it's when there's something that I desire that I haven't got. And sometimes it's not what God desires that makes me pray earnestly, but it's what I desire that makes me pray earnestly. That's a challenge, isn't it? And this is what a church looks like when it's run by the wisdom from below. Conflict and selfish, me-centered prayers. Now we might think that a little bit of self-interest isn't too much of a problem. You know, you've got to look out for yourself, haven't you? Who else is going to? But James wants us to see how much this wisdom from below infecting the church is a real big problem. And he uses strong words, doesn't he, at the beginning of verse 4. Really strong words. "You adulterous people." That's what he calls these Christians. You adulterous people. That's a picture borrowed from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel were sort of the bride. They were in a covenant with God. And when they forsook that covenant and turned to other gods and were unfaithful, they were called adulterous. They were the unfaithful bride. This is seen in the prophet Hosea most vividly. Hosea is a prophet at a time when the people of Israel were following idols, and Hosea is called to go and marry a prostitute who is going to be unfaithful to him time and time and time again. It's this lived out picture before the people of Israel of what they are doing to their God. They are being unfaithful to him. And God takes divided loyalties among his people personally. As personally as a husband who found his wife in bed with another man. That's why James calls these people, you adulterous people. This kind of picking and choosing between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of heaven. That's how stark it is. Like I said, these people, they've been given new birth. Look back at 1 verse 18. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. That's God's purpose. He's given us birth according to his own will, that we may be a first fruits of his creatures. We saw last week that God is planting seed in this field and raising this harvest of righteousness. People who live according to God's wisdom and God's ways. And so to go back to flirting with this old wisdom, it's terrible. We cannot live for the world and live for God. James goes on to put it more starkly in verse 4. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? No, can you see there's no fence sitting? There's no middle ground. To be a friend with the world is to be an enemy of God. He goes on, therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And God is pictured as a jealous husband, a rightfully jealous husband. And in verse 5, James quotes from the scriptures, although it's not clear exactly where he's quoting from. I think he's quoting more a summary of the word rather than a specific verse. And he says this: he yearns jealously over the Spirit he has made to dwell in us. The Christian has the Spirit of God living within them. And God is jealous for his people. He's rescued us for a purpose. So that's the conflict of worldly wisdom. This whole book is about having a wholehearted devotion to God right to the end. Not turning back. And James is intent on calling out those who are flirting with the wisdom of the world. Let's move on to the grace of heavenly wisdom. That's verses 6 to 10, the grace of heavenly wisdom. How does God respond? I love verse 6. Just look at verse 6. But he gives more grace. God is a God of grace. And even when we go astray, he gives more grace. He gives us more unmerited favour. That's our only hope. That's our only hope as we seek together to live out this new life in Jesus. It's God's grace. Then he goes on to quote from the scriptures from the book of Proverbs. He says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And that quote helps us understand what our responsibility is to God's grace. God is a God of grace, and we have a responsibility to him, and that is humility. That is to humble ourselves. In the Old Testament, there's a book of Job, and Job is a great book. It's a book full of wisdom. And in the book of Job, Job asks a question in chapter 28. It's this kind of chapter inserted right at the heart of the book. Where can I find wisdom? Where does wisdom come from? He pictures this man digging down into the mines to try and find some treasures. Where do you get wisdom from? And Job comes to the conclusion in the last verse of chapter 28, concludes with this: the fear of Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. That's, Job says, that's where you find wisdom. Fearing the Lord and shunning evil. And that's essentially what James goes on to tell us in verses 7 to 10. So verse 7, the response to God's grace is to submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This means we are to submit our desires to his, to order our desires below what God desires. That's what it means to submit. And he calls us also to resist the devil. The devil is our great enemy. When we become Christians, we get a father, but we also get an enemy, the devil. And we've seen that this wisdom from below is demonic. It's of the devil. And the devil in churches, he loves to stir conflict. He loves to see a church living according to the world's rules. But James says, resist the devil. Resist his wisdom. He's the one who wrote the textbook on worldly wisdom. And we're called to resist him, to stand our ground. And then in verse 8, there's some words of comfort for us. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. This is God's grace. I'm sure as we thought about conflict earlier on, we're all aware of times when we've run our relationships within the church according to the wisdom of the world. It's like a spotlight, God's word, isn't it? It puts us there and shows us what we're like. And I'm sure we're all aware of times we've said things that haven't been helpful, times when we've stirred things up rather than made peace. And when we do things wrong, there's a temptation to hang back from God. There's a temptation to think, I've got to sort this out before I come back to God. But that's not the pattern. See what James says to these people who are having all sorts of conflict. He says, draw near to God. That's the first thing we should do when we realize we've gone astray. Draw near to God, and the promise is that he will draw near to you. What a God of grace we have. Having drawn near to God, the one who Ada reminds us makes us clean. He's the one who gives us clean hearts. He's the one who forgives all of our sin. James instructs us, verse 8, cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Washing our hands, he wants us to kind of clean up our external behaviour. He wants us to stop the sniping words. And then he says, purify your hearts. He wants us to renew our devotion to the Lord Jesus. Not be double-minded, not be kind of blowing hot and cold, but just be seeking wholeheartedly to live according to the wisdom from above. And then there's more. There's more for us to do. Verse 9. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. That's what it means to humble ourselves before the Lord, to weep and to mourn and to turn our joy and laughter to sorrow and sadness. This is where heavenly wisdom begins. And being part of a church, it gives us lots of opportunity for this kind of humility. It really does. There's a way to do church where we all keep arm's length from one another. We don't let each other in, and we come and we go. And when we do that, we miss out. If we really let one another in, and which I know we do here at Cape and Ray, but I want us to do it more and more. If we let one another in, it's difficult. We see other people's desires, those wrong desires. We feel our own wrong desires. And the temptation when that happens is that we can just draw back. But we're not to draw back. This is an encouragement for us to draw near to God and to humble ourselves. When we have conflict among ourselves, it's not the end of the world. But it's an opportunity to humble ourselves, to be sorrowful for our selfish desires, and to draw near to God. Sometimes when church becomes difficult, people move on. But that's to miss a great opportunity. That's to miss a great opportunity for God to work among us. I wonder, the question I asked myself as I looked at this was, when was the last time I mourned or cried about my own sinful desire? That's a challenging question, isn't it? When was the last time I was so down, so humble before God, because I recognised something of my selfish ambition and bitter envy? This verse 9 here is not just here for us to read, it's here for us to do. This is where wisdom starts. Fearing God and shunning evil, humbling ourselves before him and mourning over our sin. We love when we come to church, don't we, to be encouraged and to be built up, and that's great. That's good. But also the gospel brings us low. It brings us low and then it lifts us up. It humbles us and then it exalts us. That's what we see at the end of verse 9. In verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will exalt you. If there's anyone here who's not a Christian this morning, this is where being a Christian begins. This kind of humility. This is where the path of wisdom starts, humbling ourselves before God, mourning over our own sin and wanting to go a different way, receiving the forgiveness that is ours in Jesus. And for a lot of us, we've been Christians for a little while, and this is where the Christian life continues. This is the path of wisdom, humbling ourselves before the Lord, mourning over our sin. This kind of sorrow should be the colour of thread that's always present in the tapestry of a Christian's emotional life. Sorrow isn't the complete everything of the Christian's emotion. No, there's joy, there's all sorts of things, but sorrow should always be there. That thread should always be there in the tapestry. Because there's a paradox at the heart of this gracious heavenly wisdom. A paradox is two things that kind of go together but seem like they shouldn't go together. And there's a paradox to the heavenly wisdom. And it's this: the way up, the way down is the way up. The first shall be last. It's the mourners who are comforted. And we don't like this humble posture, at least I don't. It seems to recoil from it. We think the posture of humility is the posture of the loser. And according to the wisdom of the world, that's true. But according to the wisdom of heaven, the posture of humility is the posture of the winner. That's how the kingdom of God works. It's the kingdom where the Creator comes down in humility to the creation. It's where the Master comes to serve and give himself. It's the kingdom where the King dies on a cross in place of his people. That's God's kingdom. That's the gracious wisdom of heaven. And so James says to us this morning, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. At home I have a book of prayers called The Valley of Vision. Anyone else got The Valley of Vision? It's a great little book of prayers. And there's one prayer in it from which the book takes its name. And it says this. Maybe we could pray along in our hearts. Lord, high and holy, meek and lowly, you have brought me to the valley of vision, where I live in the depths, but see you in the heights. Hemmed in by mountains, I see your glory. Let me learn the paradox. The way down is the way up. To be low is to be high. That the broken heart is the healed heart. The contrite spirit is the rejoicing spirit. The repenting soul is the victorious soul. That to bear the cross is to wear a crown. That to give is to receive. And that the valley is the place of vision. That's a beautiful prayer, isn't it? I think that's what James is driving at here. This is the wisdom of heaven. Let's look, as we close, at the final two verses of our passage. Words of a wise church. With this correct view of wisdom now in view, James turns his eyes back to the church and gives them instruction as to how they use their words. So he says this, verse 11, do not speak evil against one another, brothers, or do not slander. They're the kind of comments that slide off our tongue easily, that cast shadows over someone's character. Don't have to be untrue words. They can be true words, but spoken with the desire to bring someone down. Like I said, we can slander someone to their faces, or we can gossip about them behind their back. But what we're doing when we slander someone, we're talking down to people. We're taking a position of superiority and looking down on someone who is inferior and judging them with our words. We're like the emperor in the arena, and the gladiators are out there fighting away, and we're the emperor that has the right to put the thumb up or the thumb down. And that we exercise that right when we slander others. We say things like, oh, he's got a problem, or that's just what they're like. And when we do that, we sit, James says, in judgment of our brothers, and also in judgment over the law. Can you remember, we looked at the law a couple of chapters ago, and James summarised the royal law as loving our neighbour as ourselves, exemplified by the Good Samaritan. When we slander each other, we do the exact opposite of that. We don't love them and lift them up and care for them. We push them down and judge them. Grace lifts the humble, but when we slander, we cast others down. In the wise church, the church run according to God's wisdom, words will be used to lift one another up, not to bring one another down. They won't be used as weapons of conflict. They'll be used for mercy. It doesn't mean there's no place for criticism in the right way. James has used pretty hard words, hasn't he? Verse 4, you adulterous people. They're hard words. But those words from James aren't shot down from a position of superiority to push people down. Those words are shot down from the bottom, and they want to lift people up. The whole reason why James is writing, we see at the end of the letter, my brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. James, with his word, is wanting to help people. He's wanting to encourage people on the path of salvation, even though they're hard words. So it's a challenge to us this morning. Are we a wise church? Are we becoming a more wise church according to the wisdom of heaven? How do we use our words? What do we do when we face conflict, when there's disagreement? Do we draw battle lines and go our separate ways? Or do we recognise our own selfish hearts and mourn and weep and draw near to God that He would pour in His grace? We shouldn't expect to be a church where there is no conflict. Ultimately, that doesn't happen until the Lord returns. We will continue to battle with selfish ambition and bitter envy and all these desires that plague our hearts. But what we want to be is a church that's wise, that's turning away from those things again and again and again. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing, and we're going to come round the table. Let's just pray together.